And then one day we get so alert to threat that we can see threat lurking in the future. And then all of a sudden we become aware of the future, and then we become aware of death, and then we're really self-conscious. But it's pretty good if you want to keep the snakes down, which we've been doing quite successfully ever since then. But it's a big price to pay. We got so damn sensitive to threat that we were finally able to conceive the ultimate threat, not proximal threats, but the fact of threat itself, and the fact of mortality itself, and the fact of finitude itself. And maybe women learn that because they become painfully aware of the mortal limitations of their infants first, right? This small thing could die, could end, and certainly as an object of predation. And you can imagine, God only knows how many infants human beings lost to predators. I mean, I told you at one point, I believe that there was a cat that was found that had a skull and jaws that were specialized for biting the skulls of proto-humans. So one long tooth at the back that would drive right through the back of the skull, so the cat could put its teeth here and drive the tooth right into the back of the skull. So, you know, that's a good enough dragon for our intents and purposes, I would say. Anyways, the snake comes along and opens the woman's eyes. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eye, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. Well, there's a lot happening in those few lines. Now, there's a fruit thing going on there. Snake and fruit. Okay, so we know from Lynn Isbell, hypothetically, that the reason that primates like us developed our intense vision is because we co-evolved with snakes. So the snakes opened her eyes. What about fruit? Color vision. Right, why? To detect ripe fruit. We know that. And are women and ripe fruit the same? Well, they're the same insofar as it was women offering the ripe fruit. And that's undoubtedly something that happened, you know. The hypothetical idea is the males hunt and bring home protein. The women gather. What are they gathering? Well, they're gathering, at minimum, ripe fruit. And then what are they doing? They're sharing it. Well, you also bring about a moral obligation when you're sharing food, right? There's an invitation to reciprocity there. And so the fact that women were sharing, let's say, ripe fruit with men also brings them into their, what would you call, builds up the basis for the potential of a reciprocal moral obligation. It's something like that. And the problem, again, for men with being allied with women and infants is that it also heightens their self-consciousness, because you're a lot tougher and more indomitable, say, if there's just you. But as soon as you have a wife, say, and then you also have an infant, well, all the burden of their self-consciousness and their vulnerability is placed upon you. Well, it's a hell of a bargain. Well, why did men accept the bargain? Well, it's partly because women stood in front of them offering them fruit, right? Well, part of the price that the men paid for that was to wake the hell up. Well, who the hell wants that? It's a lot more calming to remain asleep with no knowledge of the sort of burden of mortality that you would bear if you became self-conscious. So fine, so now they're done with it. The snake and the fruit woke them up, and they can see, and the scales drop from their eyes, and so we can really see. Well, so what does that mean? Half our brain is devoted to visual processing. So as long as our eyes got better, our brain got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. What happens when it gets big enough? Well, not only can you see, you can meta-see. You can start to see into the future. Well, that's exactly what happened to us. Not only could we see with our eyes, we could see with our imagination. And our imagination is, you can see with your eyes closed, right? Close your eyes, bring up a vision. You can imagine the future. Well, what are you seeing? You're seeing a potential future with your eyes closed. The circuitry's there. Once it's developed, you can use it to imagine. You can project your vision into places that don't even exist, and you can start to conceptualize the future. What happens when you conceptualize the future? Well, I'm spoiling the punchline. You have to work, because you can see the future coming. You think, oh, the future's coming. It isn't just the present anymore. I don't have to just worry about whether or not I'm hungry right now. I'm going to have to worry about whether I'm hungry tomorrow and next week and next month and next year, and for me and for my wife and for my child and for the community. It's like you can forget about your day-to-day existence in paradise at that point. There's no evidence that people in industrialized societies are happier than people in non-industrialized societies. In fact, quite the contrary. We're less happy. Why? Well, because we fully and constantly bear the burden of the future. Well, that's good because we don't die and we live maybe 30 years longer and we have fewer horrible diseases and all of that, but that doesn't mean it's any picnic. You have to carry that along with you wherever you go. That's the burden of self-consciousness, right? And that's exactly what happens when God finds out that Adam and Eve have become self-conscious. One of the first things he says is, jig's up now, man, you're going to be working forever. Toiling forever. It's your destiny. There's no escaping from it. Well, human beings work. What does that mean? They sacrifice the present for the future. And that's partly, as soon as this happens, like the next story, which is Cain and Abel, you see the motif of sacrifice emerge, right? That story circulates around the motif of sacrifice. Sacrifice the present for the future. Well, what's the price you pay? You don't get the present. That's a big price, right? Because what you do is, what you're doing essentially is you're taking all the potential suffering of the future and putting it into the present all the time. Well, so what happens? Well, maybe you live longer and you live healthier, but you're not without the burden that puts on you. So the eyes of them were both opened and they knew they were naked. Well, so what does that mean? Well, what does naked mean? It means you know you're vulnerable. That's exactly what it means. They know they're vulnerable. So they sew fig leaves together and make themselves aprons. So what happens is they wake up, their eyes open, they know they're vulnerable, so they discover the future, they discover their vulnerability extended into the future, and the first thing they do is build culture, right? That's the fig leaves. It's like, okay, here's the vulnerability, we put a barrier between us and the world. It's like a wall, right? Because this is externalized clothing. That's one way of thinking about it. And so to put that clothing on, and clothing is a human universal, by the way. Now, sometimes it's only used for decorative purposes, but far more often, especially in cold climates, it's used for protection. So to clothe yourself is to recognize your vulnerability and to use culture to hold it at bay. So fine, they make themselves aprons. And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. Okay. So, before Adam and Eve wake up, before they realize they're vulnerable, they don't hide from God. So what does that mean? Well, he's the spirit that goes into the unknown to conquer it and to make the world. Okay, so let's say that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to mediate between chaos and order. Okay, and you're supposed to do that forthrightly. So then the question is, what the hell's stopping you? And that answer's easy. Your knowledge of your vulnerability. Obviously, that's what's stopping you. It's like, why aren't you courageous and forthright? Well, because you can be cut off at the knees and terribly hurt. And so you're going to shrink back from that responsibility. And it's no bloody wonder, right? It's obviously what's going to happen. So, the Lord God calls unto Adam. So he's trying to, what that means, for God to call on you is to say, for God to say, I want to act through you, or I want to act with you. Or that spirit, let's say. Well, Adam says, well, I heard God says to Adam, where are you? And Adam says, I heard your voice in the garden, right? I heard the call, but I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. It's like, yes, that's exactly what human beings are like. That's precisely exactly what we're like. We hear the call, but we hide, and we have. The thing is, there's good reason for it. It's not something trivial. And God said, who told you you were naked? Did you eat the tree that I told you shouldn't eat? And the man says, the man doesn't come off very well in this particular phrase as far as I'm concerned. And this is actually quite a comedic story, except that it's also a catastrophic tragedy. It's like God calls Adam out. Like, what's with you? Now, you're hiding from me. Why? And the first thing Adam does is says, it's her fault. It's her fault. She made me self-conscious. Well, I see that in resentful men all the time. They're very antipathetic towards women, and they blame their misery and resentment on the fact that women won't have anything to do with them, while the women are making them self-conscious for not being all they should be. Because the women think, why should I bother with you if you're not the embodiment of the spirit that will move into the unknown and face the Leviathan, which is exactly what she should be saying. And you're thinking, well, I don't want to have anything to do with that, but I'd like women to like me anyways. It's like, well, good luck with that. So that doesn't work out. And so instead of getting your act together, you say, those goddamn women. That's exactly what Adam says to God. He said, well, don't be laying this on my feet. It's the woman. You made her. She made me all self-conscious and cowardly. It's like, brilliant, great, wonderful. And God says to the woman, what did you do? And the woman said, well, it was the serpent that confused me, and I ate. Well, it's like, actually, I'm a little more sympathetic to her than to Adam, all things considered, because after all, she was trying to deal with the damn snake, right? And we find out that the snake is not only the thing that preys upon her infants, but as the tradition developed, it's identified with Satan himself. So, and that's the snake in every soul. That's the right way of thinking about that. So she had her reasons, but it doesn't matter. You pay whether you have your reasons or not. And so God says to the serpent, because you've done this, you're cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field. Upon the belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. So first of all, the serpent seems to have legs, right? And then it's turned into a snake. And that's actually how it worked, by the way, because snakes had legs and they lost them. Now, you know, I'm not trying to say that this story necessarily represents that, but it's an interesting parallel. And he tells the snake, I'll put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Well, yes, well, that's the snake striking, right? And the fact that when human beings see snakes, they want to, just like the Simpsons, whacking day, right? It's time to get rid of the snakes. And that's why the many great saints are those who drive the snakes from the land, like St. Patrick or St. George and the dragon. And it's the same representation of the hero moving out into the wilderness and confronting the predatory potential is the right way of thinking about it. All right. Unto the woman, he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Well, that's a statement of destiny, not a statement of the way it should be. So what does it mean? I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. Well, self-consciousness will do that because, of course, women are fully aware of exactly how fragile their infants are. So that's a big problem. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. That's something particular to human women, right? And here's why. The price we paid for the rapid expansion of our brain, which is also something that gave us this self-consciousness and vision, meant that there's an evolutionary arms race between the pelvic width of women and the hole in the center of the pelvis and the infant's head. So what happens is the infant is born far too young for a mammal of our size, because if it was any older, the head would be too big, the pelvis would have to be too wide, its structural stability would be compromised, and then women couldn't run. So right now women are at the maximum for hip width in terms of their ability to run. So what's happened is that infants have had to be born younger with a compressible head. So, you know, the bones of an infant's skull aren't joined together, and sometimes after babies are born, their head is actually almost cone-shaped because of the tremendous pressure that was exerted on their head during the birthing process. And of course, that's killed innumerable women, right? I mean, women's life expectancy before the latter half of the 20th century was way below men because they died in childbirth all the time. And why? Well, it's a very, what do you call that? It's a very narrow gateway, and the price that women pay for it is very high risk of death, very high risk of sorrow because of death of children in childbirth, and also extraordinary pain in giving birth. So that's the price women pay for having vision and being self-conscious. Well, and then worse, they desire their husband and he'll rule over them. Well, whether or not that's good or bad, it doesn't matter. God's statement is that's how it's going to be. Well, partly that's because, as far as I can tell, there isn't really women, roughly speaking. There's women with infants. And a woman with an infant is compromised in terms of her, independent individuality to a remarkable degree, because the infant is dependent for a year, and then unbelievably dependent for like 8 years after that, and then still pretty dependent for another 5. So once you have an infant, it's no longer you. And I've talked to lots of women for whom that was a great relief, by the way, because it actually is somewhat of a relief to now not be the center of everything. You know, if you go visit your in-laws, for example, and you have a baby, it's like they pay attention to the baby. Your parents will do the same thing.